The Death of a Somnambulist. Rampo, Edogawa. It had already been 3 months since Hikotaro lost his position at the cotton wholesaler and returned to live with his father. His father, past 50, scraped by as a sort of servant at the residence of Count M, their former feudal lord. For Hikotaro, to be a burden on him was by no means pleasant. He tried everything to find employment, asking acquaintances, making inquiries himself, but in those days of depression, no shop was willing to take on a man like him, a man without schooling, without any particular skill. There was, to be sure, one offer if he would agree to live on the premises. But he declined, for there was a reason why he could never again take a position that required living in. Since childhood, Hikotaro had been prone to sleepwalking. He spoke clearly in his sleep. If someone nearby answered, unaware it was mere dreaming, he would continue the conversation indefinitely. By morning, he would remember nothing. So lucid were his words that neighbors whispered of it as uncanny. The habit had once abated when he left elementary school and entered service, but strangely, after he turned 20, it returned and worsened rapidly. At first, it was no more than rising at midnight and wandering about. That much might have been excused as eerie but harmless. But the attacks grew worse. At times, still asleep, he would unbolt the shutters of the shop, the very cotton dealer, where he worked as a live-in clerk, wander around the neighborhood, then return and lock up again, never waking. Even this might have been tolerated, had it not escalated into something more dangerous. In his sleep, he began to bring back things that belonged to others. In short, he became, without knowing it, a thief. And because it happened 2, 3 times, the shop could no longer keep him, however much it was the act of an unconscious man. Thus, with only 3 years remaining before he could complete his service and be rewarded with his own shop curtain, Hikotaro was summarily dismissed. When he first realized he was a somnambulist, how great was his shock. He spent what little pocket money he had to consult doctors. He bought medical texts, attempting self-treatment. He prayed to the gods and Buddhas, even going so far as to abstain from his favorite food, rice cakes, in hopes of divine healing. But nothing worked. The dreadful malady only deepened, and in time came those terrifying nocturnal crimes. Ah, what accursed fate was his! He could do nothing but bewail his misfortune. So far, he had at least escaped punishment by law. But what of the future? Might he not, in one of his wanderings, commit some greater crime? Might he not, perhaps, even kill? Books and physicians alike reported cases of somnambulists committing murder. He remembered well a tale told by the old cook at the cotton shop of a virtuous wife in his village who, while sleepwalking, had taken up the grass, cutting sickle, and slain her own husband. To think of such things made Hikotaro dread the night. What to others was a bed of rest was, to him, alone, a place of torment like hell. True, since returning home his fits seemed somewhat less frequent, but that gave him little comfort. He could never risk another live-in post. His father, however, could not fathom his refusal. To him, it looked as though his son had inexplicably turned down good fortune. For the father knew nothing of his adult-onset illness, nor did he clearly understand the reason Hikotaro had been dismissed from the cotton dealer. One day, a cart pulled up before their cramped 2-room dwelling in the row houses at Count M's estate. From it descended Hikotaro, oddly grinning, carrying a wicker trunk. Startled, his father asked what had happened. Hikotaro only gave a little laugh through his nose and replied vaguely that he had been embarrassed by some incident. The next day, a letter arrived from the cotton dealer. It stated, in the customary phrases, that due to certain circumstances, we must temporarily return your son to you. Please rest assured, it was not due to any fault of his own. The father immediately jumped to conclusions. He assumed, of course, that his son had picked up a taste for the tea house and squandered the shop's money. And so, whenever he had the chance, he would sit his son before him and scold him in the old-fashioned manner. "You weakling, you disgrace." When Hikotaro first came home, matters would surely have been simple if he had just said, "Here is how it is." But he let the moment pass, and once his father had gotten the wrong idea and begun lecturing him, his nature was such that, come what might, he could no longer bring himself to tell the truth. His mother had died 3 years earlier. He had no siblings. It was truly a household of one parent and one child. Yet precisely because of that, a strange feeling one might call familial loathing set in between them, so that each sensed a vague estrangement from the other. One reason Hikotaro stubbornly hid his illness was that he was hindered by this very feeling. And of course, at 23, he also found it unbearably embarrassing to confess. On top of that, when he turned down the rare offer of a job, his father grew all the more enraged. That anger reflected back on Hikotaro, and he too became irritably on edge. Lately, the moment they spoke, they would be at one another's throats. Otherwise, they could glare at each other in silence for hours. Today was no different. After 2 or 3 days of rain, Hikotaro could not even go out for the walks that had become his daily routine. He had finished the chapbooks he'd borrowed from the neighborhood lending library, and, with nowhere to put himself, sat vacantly before his father's little desk. In the cramped 4.5-mat room and adjoining 3-mat room, everything from tatami to walls to ceiling was damp through and through. A stifling odor that at once called his father to mind pricked his nostrils, and though it rained, it was the height of August, suffocatingly humid. Die, die, die. Snatching up the heavy, misshapen paperweight, like a lump of hammered-together lead scraps, he banged the top of the desk at random, shouting in reckless despair. Then again he would fall into long, stubborn silence, sunk in thought. At such times, he was surely dreaming of 100,000 yen. Ah, I want 100,000 yen. Then I wouldn't have to work. The interest alone would be enough to live on. Even this illness, if I saw a great doctor and spent money freely, it might be cured. And father, at his age, he wouldn't have to slave away so miserably. It's all money, money. If only I had 100,000 yen. Let's see. At 6%, that's 6,000 a year, 500 a month, splendid. Then the scene from the tea house he had once visited with the head clerk at the cotton shop would rise before him. The face of the geisha with the dark brows who had sat at his side, her voice, her alluring little gestures. So then what was it? Ah yes, the 100,000 yen. But where on earth would such money come from? Damn it. Die, die, die. And again, thud, thud, he hammered the desk with the paperweight. While he was thus repeating himself, the electric lamp was lit without his noticing, and his father came home. "I'm back. My, how it pours." Lately, the sound of that voice sent a chill through him. His father dealt with his rain-spattered shoes, then sat with a weary sigh before the shabby long brazier in the 4.5 mat room, took off his wet navy student collar jacket, stripped down to a single crepe shirt, and, drawing a brass natamame pipe from his trouser pocket, took his first puff. "Hikotaro, did you put anything on to cook?" He had been assigned kitchen duty by his father, but almost never carried it out. Even in the mornings, it was often his father who, grumbling, kindled the fire under the pot himself. Today, of course, there was no preparation at all. "Hey, why won't you answer? Look, the water's not even boiling. I can't even wipe myself down." Since Hikotaro said nothing whatever, his father had no choice. With a groan he stood, went down into the tiny kitchen, and began rummaging about to prepare supper. Sensing this, Hikotaro kept staring at the wall before the desk, his chest boiling, with a feeling he could name neither hatred nor grief nor anything else. On a fine day, he would have walked out without a word, letting his feet carry him through the streets. But today, he could not, and so he did nothing but glare at the rain, stained wall, endlessly. Presently, with grilled salmon as the meager centerpiece, his father set out their poor fare and began the one pleasure he had, his evening sock. When the single flask was half empty, his spirits began to rise, and the usual sermon commenced. "Hikotaro, come here a moment. Why is it you can't answer when I speak to you? If I say come here, then come." So, with no choice, Hikotaro remained at the desk, but turned to face his father for the first time. There, aside from the bald pate and the wrinkles, was a face just like his own, flushed with drink, eyes glazed and wide. "Aren't you ashamed to be lazing about every day?" Then followed a long anecdote about some neighbor's exemplary son, and at last, "Listen, I'm not asking you to support me. Only stop gnawing at this old man's shins and idling about. I beg you. Do you understand? Do you or don't you?" "I understand," Hikotaro snapped back, furious. "That's why I'm doing my utmost to find a position. If there isn't one, what am I supposed to do?" "There must be. Why did you turn down the place Mr. So-and-so told us about the other day? I can't make head or tail of you." "I told you I won't live in." "What's wrong with living in? Commuting, living in, there's no real difference." "Do you think you're in any position to be so picky? Why did you lose the last shop? All because of your stubbornness. You may fancy yourself a full-fledged man, but you know nothing. When someone recommends a place, you should say, 'Yes, sir,' and go. Even if you say that, I've already turned it down. There's nothing to be done now." "And that's exactly why you're insolent. Who turned it down without consulting me? You did. You refuse it on your own and then say there's nothing to be done. What nerve?" "Then what do you want me to do? If I'm such a nuisance, I'll leave. Fine, tomorrow, I'll go." "Fool, is that how you speak to your father?" Suddenly, his father's hand seized the flask and hurled it at Hikotaro's brow. "What are you doing?" No sooner had he cried out than Hikotaro sprang at his father. Madness. And so began that most wretched of spectacles, father and son grappling. Nor was this confined to tonight. Of late it had become a nightly routine. Sooner or later, in these scuffles, it was always Hikotaro who, unable to endure, would burst into tears. What was so sad? Everything. Unspeakably. Everything. His 50-year-old father, in a student collar jacket, laboring for wages. Himself, loafing in his father's house, the 3-mat and 4.5-mat hovel, like a beggar shack. Everything was sad. And And then what happened after that? His father seemed to have taken a bath token from the brazier drawer and gone off to the public bath. When he returned a while later, he tried to make peace with him. The skies cleared completely. "Hey, are you already in bed? It's a fine moon. Want to step out into the garden and look?" he said, and he himself went down from the veranda into the yard. All the while, Hikotaro lay face down against the wall in the 4.5 mat room, exactly as he had fallen when he burst into tears without stirring a muscle. He had not hung the mosquito net. He simply let the mosquitoes feast on him from head to toe, and, like a sulking wife, in a fit of hopelessness, he kept repeating his usual phrase, "Die, die," over and over in his head like a prayer. And before he knew it, he fell asleep. And then, what happened after that? The next morning, woken early by the dazzling sunlight pouring in through the open veranda, Hikotaro noticed that the room felt strangely bare. The mosquito net had not been hung, and the bedding had not been laid out. Everything as it had been the night before. Had his father already gone to work? He looked at the pillar clock. It was barely past 6. Something felt off. Rubbing the sleep from his eyes, he happened to glance out toward the garden. And what was this? His father was slumped there in the wicker chair. Surely he wasn't asleep. With a sudden foreboding in his chest, Hikotaro slipped on the clogs by the veranda and hurried to the chair. Readers, one never knows where misfortune lies. There were 2 pairs of clogs at the veranda. The pair he happened to put on was the plain wooden Hiorigeta. Had he instead put on the other pair, the old Polonia, soled indoor clogs, perhaps what followed might never have happened. Drawing near, he was struck dumb with shock. His father was dead. Both hands dangled from the chair's armrests, his body bent double at the waist so that head and knees nearly touched. Thus, whether he wished to or not, he could see it. The back of the head was badly injured. There was no bleeding, but it was clearly the fatal wound. The brilliant light of a summer morning shone almost ceremoniously on the strange stillness of the body, as if it were a built-in doll. A horsefly, with a dull droning of wings, circled above the dead man's head. So sudden was it that for a time Hikotaro stood there dazed, wondering if he were not trapped in a nightmare. But of course it could not be a dream. He ran across the garden to the entrance of the adjoining count's residence and reported what had happened to a student who happened to be there. Soon, at the count's telephone call, a group of policemen arrived, with a police doctor among them. He first examined the body. The result: death by concussion from a blow with a blunt instrument. Time of death around 10 o'clock the previous night. Hikotaro was summoned before the station chief and questioned at length. The count's steward was interrogated as well, but neither of them knew anything that might aid the police. Then the scene investigation began. Besides the chief, 2 detectives in business suits conferred back and forth, proceeding briskly and professionally. Hikotaro, with the servants from the count's house, watched them in a daze. The shock had numbed his wits. Even then, he had noticed nothing. A nameless dread had seized him, but he had no idea why. It was a bleak open space of 4 or 5 ken beyond the back gate, called a garden, but really a bare sandy lot. Facing Hikotaro's house stood the count's 3-story Western-style building. To the right, beyond a high concrete wall, lay the street. To the left, a broad path led to the count's front entrance. Near the middle sat an old, worn-out wicker chair, discarded by the main house. The case was naturally treated as homicide, yet no trace of the culprit, no abandoned object was found around the body. The entire ground was searched from corner to corner. Aside from 5 or 6 cedars planted along the Western-style building, there was not a single shrub or potted plant, just bare sand. No stones, no sticks, nothing that might have served as a weapon. In short, nothing suspicious at all. There was only one thing. Among the grass at the foot of a cedar, about a ken from the chair, lay a bundle of dahlias. No one noticed such a bit of greenery. Or even if someone had, no special attention was paid. They were looking for different things, so-called abandoned articles, a strip of towel, a wallet, something of that nature. In the end, the only clue was footprints. Fortunately, days of rain had left the ground smooth, so that only prints made after the rain stopped the previous night remained clear. Even so, many people had already tramped about that morning, and sorting them all was arduous, matching them patiently. This set belongs to so-and-so, that set to someone else. They finally found one set that belonged to no one. They were broad prints from indoor clogs, it seemed, tracked all over the place, crisscrossing, as if their owner had wandered at random. One detective followed them, and curiously enough, the trail started from the veranda of Hikotaro's house and returned there. On the token shoe removal stone at the veranda lay, neatly set aside, an old pair of Polonia indoor clogs that matched the prints exactly. When the detectives began examining the prints, Hikotaro had already noticed those old clogs. He had not once entered the house since discovering the body, so the prints must have been made the previous night. If so, who on earth had worn those clogs? At that, something finally occurred to him. For a moment, he nearly fainted, but somehow held on. A viscous whirl began to spin inside his skull. Like a lens thrown out of focus, the scene before him blurred and slid away. And in its place rose a vision. Himself, raising the heavy paperweight from the desk and bringing it down on his father's skull. "Run, run, hurry, run!" Some unknown voice kept crying at his ear. Straining with all his might to appear nonchalant, he edged away from the cluster of the Count's servants, inch by inch. What an effort it cost him. At any moment he expected to hear, "Stop," and be seized. He felt scarcely alive. But fortunately, no one noticed his strange behavior, and he reached the shadow of the house unchallenged. From there, he bolted straight to the gate. A police bicycle stood, leaning there. He leapt astride it and, with no thought for direction, pedaled blindly. Rows of houses streamed backward, hissing past. Again and again he nearly collided with passers-by and toppled. Each time he veered away by a hair and sped on. He had no idea what street he was on. When he was about to burst onto a busy tramway, he wrenched the handlebars toward the lonelier streets, the lonelier lanes. How long he rode under the blazing sun he did not know. In his mind, he had fled for 10 leagues. At least yet Tokyo would not end. Perhaps he had been circling the same district over and over. Then, all at once, bang! A sharp report, and his bicycle was useless. He abandoned the bicycle and began to run. His white kusuri kimono was soaked through with sweat, as if he'd been plunged into water. His legs had gone numb, like sticks. At the slightest obstacle, he stumbled and fell. His heart thrashed crazily in his chest. His throat was parched, wheezing like an asthmatic. He had already forgotten why he had to run, forgotten his original purpose. Only the ghastly vision of parricide rising before his eyes drove him on. A block, 2 blocks, 3 reeling like a drunk, he fell and rose and ran. But such pitiful effort could not last. At length, he collapsed and lay still. The blazing midsummer sun beat down, sizzling, on his body caked with sweat and dust. After a while, when a policeman, alerted by passers-by, took hold of his shoulders to lift him up, he made a feeble motion, as if to break away and flee, but that was the end. Held in the officer's arms, he breathed his last. Meanwhile, what had been happening beside his father's corpse at the Count's residence? The police noticed Hikotaro's flight only after he had already fled half a mile. Realizing that pursuit would be useless, the chief at once used the Count's telephone to notify headquarters and ordered arrangements for Hikotaro's arrest. Then they continued their on-site investigation, awaiting the prosecutor's arrival. They were, of course, convinced Hikotaro was the culprit. The only clue at the scene was the pair of Polonia clogs found at his veranda, and the man who should be presumed their owner, Hikotaro, had fled. Those two stubborn facts seemed proof enough of his guilt. Only two questions remained. Why had he murdered his own father? And why, if he was the killer, had he lingered without fleeing until the police arrived? Both, they assumed, would be answered once he was caught. But just as the case seemed to be settling, something wholly unexpected occurred. "I killed him. I did," said a man with a deathly pale face, running from the Count's house straight to the chief. Like a fever patient, he could say nothing else, repeating, "I did. I did." The chief and the detective stared, dumbfounded, at this strange intruder. Could such a thing be? Surely this man hadn't put on the Polonia clogs from Hikotaro's house. If not, how could he have committed murder without leaving any footprints? They decided, for the moment, to hear his statement. It was astonishing, a fact so extraordinary, it could have been a record since the founding of the police. The man, one of the students employed at the Count's, confessed the following. The previous day, several guests had dined in the Great Hall on the third floor of the Western-style building. They departed around 9 o'clock. He had been ordered to clean up and was moving about the room when he stumbled on the edge of the carpet and fell. In falling, he knocked over a tall stand placed in a corner for a flower vessel, and what sat upon it flew out through an open window. Had it been a vase, this mistake might not have led to such an outcome. But though the stand was for a vase, the object atop it was not a vase at all. It was a block of ice, a decorative flower ice, that would melt away to nothing in 5 or 6 hours. The stand had a fixture to catch dripping water, so only the ice itself fell. It had been on display all afternoon and had mostly melted, leaving little more than a core. Even so, it seems to have been enough to cause a concussion in an old man. Startled, he looked down from the window and by the moonlight saw the elderly porter lying dead. Imagine his horror. However accidental, he had killed a man. Panicked, should he tell everyone? What should he do? He dithered as time slipped by. Suppose no one discovered it before morning. What then? The thought occurred to him. The ice would melt, of course it would. The dahlias embedded within might remain, but perhaps no one would notice. Or should he go down now and gather the fragments? No, if he were seen doing that, he would surely be branded the criminal. He went to bed, but did not sleep a wink. Come morning, the affair took a surprising turn. Hearing the details from his co-workers, he was, for a moment, relieved that things had somehow worked out. But being an honest soul, he could not simply keep silent while another man was branded with a dreadful crime in his stead. The thought terrified him. And even if he escaped for the moment, the truth would surely come out in time. So, steeling himself, he came straight to the chief to confess. Such was his account. Those who heard it could do nothing for a time but stare at one another, so unexpected, so anticlimactic was the truth. Hikotaro, then, had acted rashly. Barely 30 minutes had passed since his flight. And had he, or, failing him, the detectives or the Count's people paid closer attention to that bundle of dahlias lying at the cedar's root and grasped its meaning, Hikotaro need not have died. Still, it's odd, the police chief said at last, frowning. What about those footprints? And why did the dead man's son run? I've got it now, I see, cried one of the detectives, who had just tried on the suspect clogs. The footprints are nothing. Put these on, and it's obvious. They're cracked, They look fine, but when you wear them, you can feel a split right down the middle about to come apart. No one would be comfortable walking in them. The victim must have noticed while walking in the yard and changed shoes. If the detective's conjecture was right, they had been in an uproar over the victim's own prints. What a bitter mistake, perhaps, born of the reasonable premise that since a murder had occurred, there must be a killer's footprints. 2 days later, 2 coffins passed out through the gate of Count M's residence, containing, needless to say, the unhappy somnambulist Hikotaro and his father. All who heard the tale pitied the pair. And yet one point remained forever an unsolved riddle. Why did Hikotaro attempt to flee?